I once sat across from someone who claimed he could read energy, the kind who stares a second too long, asks nothing, and still seems to know too much. He closed his eyes, went quiet, and when he opened them, the confidence was gone. His voice dropped. He didn't describe my past, didn't predict my future. He just leaned back, like he'd touched something dangerous, and said no human should have this power. See, most people think power is loud, flashy, obvious. But the real kind is silent. It's the ability to walk into a room and change the temperature without saying a word. It's pressure behind the smile, chaos dressed as calm, discipline sharpened by pain, ambition fed by everything that tried to break you. People get uncomfortable around that, not because it's evil, but because it's uncontrolled, unpredictable, and it doesn't ask for permission. Power that makes people uncomfortable is rarely the kind people celebrate in public. It isn't loud confidence or borrowed authority. It's not domination, volume, or intimidation. It's the kind of power that emerges when someone has confronted their own capacity for chaos and decided to integrate it rather than deny it. That unsettles people, because most individuals spend their lives avoiding that confrontation. They suppress what they are capable of becoming, both good and bad, and then convince themselves that restraint is virtue when it's actually fear. When a person has voluntarily faced their own darkness, resentment, anger, aggression, ambition, and brought it under disciplined control, something changes in the way they stand, speak, and listen. There's a weight to them. They don't need to announce boundaries, because boundaries are implied. They don't chase validation because their internal hierarchy is already structured. That kind of presence destabilizes others because it exposes the fragility of social masks. People sense, often unconsciously, that this is someone who cannot be easily manipulated, guilted, or coerced. Discomfort arises because such power doesn't play the usual social games. It doesn't signal harmlessness just to be accepted. It doesn't perform weakness to invite approval. Instead, it communicates capability with restraint. And restraint is terrifying when it's backed by competence. A dangerous person who chooses to be controlled is far more threatening than a harmless person pretending to be virtuous. The latter is predictable. The former is not, and unpredictability is something the nervous system reacts to immediately. This kind of power often develops through suffering that wasn't avoided or anesthetized, through responsibility accepted rather than deflected, through failure examined honestly instead of blamed on the world. When someone has been to the edge of psychological disorder and voluntarily imposed order on their own life, they carry evidence of that internal structure with them. Their speech becomes precise. Their actions are economical. They don't waste energy proving themselves because they already know what they can endure. People become uncomfortable because this power challenges their excuses. It silently asks questions no one wants to answer. What could you be if you stopped lying to yourself? What potential have you left undeveloped because it demanded sacrifice? What resentment are you nurturing instead of transforming into competence? These questions don't need to be spoken. They emerge naturally in the presence of someone who has already wrestled with them and survived. There is also a moral dimension to this discomfort. Power integrated with responsibility implies accountability. If you are capable, then you are responsible, and responsibility is heavy. It removes the comfort of victimhood and the safety of anonymity. When someone embodies strength without arrogance, it undermines the collective agreement to remain mediocre. It reveals that chaos can be ordered, that suffering can be given meaning, and that weakness is not an identity, but a temporary condition. That realization destabilizes belief systems built on avoidance. It disrupts narratives that frame life as something that merely happens to you, rather than something you actively shape. Power like this doesn't threaten people by attacking them. It threatens them by existing, by standing there as evidence that a higher standard is possible, and that the cost of not meeting it is self-inflicted rather than imposed by fate or society. Silence, louder than words, is not the absence of communication, but the concentration of it. It's what remains when speech has been stripped of its nervous excess, its compulsive need to justify, explain, and defend. Most people talk because they're afraid of the void that silence exposes. In that void, inadequacy becomes audible, uncertainty becomes visible. Silence forces confrontation with the self. And that is precisely why it carries such weight, when someone can inhabit it without discomfort. A person who is comfortable in silence has already sorted out a great deal of internal chaos. They are not scrambling to fill space with noise to prove their relevance. They do not speak to regulate their anxiety. Their words are optional, not compensatory. That changes the entire dynamic of interaction. When someone pauses before speaking, listens without interruption, and allows gaps to exist, it signals self-possession. It suggests that thought precedes speech, not the other way around. Silence becomes loud because it disrupts expectation. Social systems are built on predictable cues, smiles, nods, verbal affirmations, rapid responses. When those cues are withheld, people project meaning into the gap. They start talking more, revealing more than they intended. They over-explain, defend positions that weren't attacked, and expose insecurities that would have remained hidden if the silence hadn't pressured them. The quiet person doesn't extract information by force. They allow others to give it away voluntarily. There is also an ethical dimension to silence. Words have consequences. Once spoken, they cannot be retrieved. And poorly chosen language can damage relationships, institutions, and lives. A disciplined silence reflects respect for that power. It suggests someone who understands that truth is not something to be sprayed indiscriminately, but aimed carefully. That restraint contrasts sharply with a culture addicted to constant expression, where saying something, anything, has become more important than saying something true. Silence also communicates boundaries. It signals that not every provocation deserves a response. Not every challenge requires engagement. Not every opinion needs validation. This is unsettling in environments where attention is currency. When someone refuses to perform, refuses to react, refuses to be pulled into emotional chaos, it exposes how much of public interaction is driven by impulse rather than intention. The ability to remain silent in moments of tension is particularly revealing. It indicates emotional regulation under pressure. It shows that fear does not immediately translate into action. Anger does not hijack behavior. Anxiety does not dictate speech. That kind of control is rare because it requires practice, self-observation, and the willingness to endure discomfort without fleeing into noise. Silence can also signify that someone has nothing to prove. Proof-seeking behavior is usually loud. It announces credentials, broadcasts virtue, and demands recognition. Silence, by contrast, implies internal validation. It suggests that worth has already been established through action, rather than declared through language. People sense that, even if they can't articulate it. The quiet individual often becomes the reference point in the room, the one others look to before deciding how serious a situation really is. This kind of silence isn't passive. It's active restraint. It's the capacity to hold complexity in the mind without collapsing it into simplistic slogans. It's the willingness to think before speaking, to listen before judging, and to tolerate ambiguity without dissolving into confusion. That depth makes silence resonate because it carries potential. When someone like that finally speaks, the words land with disproportionate force, not because they're louder, but because they've been earned. Pain converted in a discipline is one of the most reliable indicators of genuine psychological development. Pain, by itself, is chaotic, it disorients, destabilizes, and narrows perception. Left unexamined, it turns into bitterness, resentment, or a permanent grievance against the world. But when pain is voluntarily confronted and structured, it becomes a source of order rather than disorder. That transformation does not happen accidentally. It requires conscious effort, reflection, and the willingness to take responsibility for one's own suffering. Most people attempt to escape pain as quickly as possible. They numb it, distract themselves, or externalize it by blaming circumstances, institutions, or other people. While that provides temporary relief, it also ensures repetition. Unprocessed pain returns, often amplified because it hasn't been given meaning. Discipline, on the other hand, imposes a framework. It says this happened, it hurt, and now it will be used. That decision alone shifts the individual from passive victim to active participant in their own life. Discipline forged from pain is different from discipline imposed by external authority. It is internal, self-directed, and durable. It doesn't rely on supervision or fear of punishment. It emerges from an understanding that chaos, if left unchecked, will continue to dominate. The person who adopts discipline in response to pain is making a wager that order, even if difficult, is preferable to the randomness of continued suffering. This process often begins with small, almost insignificant acts. Waking up at the same time every day, telling the truth when lying would be easier, completing tasks even when motivation is absent. These behaviors seem trivial, but they accumulate. They send a message to the psyche that pain does not dictate behavior. Over time, that message restructures identity. The individual no longer sees themselves as someone to whom things merely happen, but as someone who acts regardless of internal resistance. Pain also sharpens perception. It reveals where structures are weak and where values are misaligned. When approached honestly, it becomes diagnostic. It shows which relationships are unsustainable, which habits are destructive, and which beliefs are false. Discipline uses that information. It converts insight into action. It replaces impulsive reaction with deliberate response. That is not a suppression of emotion, but a reorganization of it. There is a moral component to this transformation. Discipline born of pain carries responsibility. It acknowledges that while suffering may not be chosen, one's response to it is. That acknowledgement is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. It demands effort where resignation would be easier. Yet it is precisely that demand that restores dignity. People feel meaningful when they are responsible, and discipline provides a pathway to that meaning. The alternative is far more common and far more destructive. Pain that is not transformed seeks expression. It leaks out through sarcasm, aggression, apathy, or nihilism. It corrodes relationships and undermines trust. In contrast, disciplined individuals tend to stabilize their environments. They become predictable in the best sense of the word. Others can rely on them because they have demonstrated that emotional turbulence does not control their actions. Over time, this conversion of pain into discipline generates strength that is quiet but substantial. It is not the strength of someone who has never suffered, but of someone who has suffered and learned. That kind of strength carries credibility. It does not need to be advertised. It is visible in consistency, in restraint, and in the capacity to endure without collapsing into chaos or cruelty. Control over chaos, not escape from it, is a principle that sits at the center of psychological maturity. Chaos is inevitable. It emerges in the form of uncertainty, suffering, conflict, and limitation. Attempts to flee from it are understandable, but they are also counterproductive. Avoidance does not eliminate chaos. It merely displaces it, often into areas of life where it becomes harder to manage and more destructive over time. Many people pursue safety by narrowing their lives. They reduce risk, responsibility, and ambition in an effort to maintain comfort. What they often fail to realize is that excessive safety breeds fragility. When challenges inevitably arise, the individual lacks the internal structure necessary to respond. Control, in contrast, requires engagement. It demands that chaos be faced directly, analyzed carefully, and shaped gradually through disciplined action. Control does not mean domination. It does not imply total mastery or the illusion of certainty. It means the capacity to remain functional and oriented in the presence of disorder. A person who has control over chaos can think clearly under pressure, regulate emotion when provoked, and act deliberately when circumstances are unstable. This capacity is not innate. It is cultivated through repeated exposure to manageable difficulty, voluntarily undertaken rather than imposed. Avoidance is often justified through rationalization. People tell themselves they are being prudent, patient, or peaceful, when in reality they are afraid. Fear masquerades as virtue when it goes unexamined. Control requires honesty about fear. It requires acknowledging vulnerability without allowing it to dictate behavior. That honesty forms the basis of courage, which is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. There is a developmental sequence at work here. Chaos encountered too early or too intensely can overwhelm. Chaos avoided entirely produces weakness. The optimal path lies between these extremes. It involves incrementally increasing responsibility, testing limits, and expanding competence. Each successful encounter with chaos strengthens confidence and refines judgment. Over time, the individual learns not only that they can survive disorder, but that they can transform it into structure. This transformation often begins internally. Emotional chaos, when left unmanaged, spills outward and disrupts relationships, work, and health. Control starts with attention, noticing patterns of thought, identifying triggers, and distinguishing between impulse and intention. That internal order then extends outward through routine, commitment, and reliability. Life becomes more predictable, not because uncertainty has disappeared, but because the individual has become more capable of responding to it. Societies reflect this principle as well. Cultures that attempt to eliminate all risk often stagnate. Those that glorify chaos collapse. Stability emerges when systems are flexible enough to adapt yet structured enough to maintain continuity. The same balance applies at the individual level. Control over chaos allows for growth without disintegration. There is also meaning in this engagement. People derive purpose from confronting difficulty and prevailing over it, even partially. Escape offers relief but no narrative. Control offers a story of competence earned through effort. That story reinforces identity and provides motivation for further development. When chaos is approached as something to be shaped rather than avoided, it loses its paralyzing quality. It becomes a source of information rather than a threat. The individual no longer waits for perfect conditions to act. They act within imperfect conditions and refine their approach through feedback and failure. That ongoing process produces resilience, adaptability, and a sense of agency that cannot be obtained through withdrawal or denial. Presence that shifts the room is not a matter of charisma in the conventional sense. It is not performance, volume, or theatrical confidence. It is the byproduct of internal alignment, where thought, emotion, and behavior are integrated rather than fragmented. When a person has achieved that integration, they carry themselves differently. Their posture is stable. Their attention is directed rather than scattered. Their responses are measured rather than reactive. Others notice this immediately, often without understanding why. This kind of presence emerges from self-regulation developed over time. People who lack it are usually at war with themselves. They are managing internal conflict, suppressing anxiety, or compensating for insecurity. That internal noise leaks outward. It manifests as fidgeting, excessive speech, performative agreement, or defensive posturing. In contrast, someone who has brought order to their inner world does not leak chaos into the environment. Their calm becomes contagious because it offers a reference point. Attention plays a critical role here. Presence is inseparable from the capacity to attend fully. When someone listens without rehearsing their response, when their gaze is steady and their focus undivided, it signals respect and competence. Others feel seen and assessed accurately rather than superficially judged. That alone alters the emotional climate of a room. People slow down. Conversations become more deliberate. Posturing gives way to substance. There is also an implicit hierarchy at work. Humans are constantly, often unconsciously, evaluating who is most capable of handling responsibility. The person with genuine presence appears prepared. They are not rushed. They are not overwhelmed by complexity. They do not collapse under scrutiny. This creates a gravitational effect. Others orient themselves around that stability, deferring not out of submission, but out of recognition. Presence that shifts the room is often forged in adversity. It develops in individuals who have been tested and have not disintegrated. Those experiences leave traces. There is an economy of movement, a precision of language, and an absence of unnecessary behavior. Nothing is wasted because waste was once costly. That efficiency communicates competence more powerfully than self-promotion ever could. Silence again plays a role. A person with presence does not compete for attention. They allow space to exist. When they speak, it is because something needs to be said, not because silence makes them uncomfortable. That restraint heightens the impact of their words. Others instinctively listen because they sense that speech is deliberate rather than impulsive. Moral clarity contributes as well. People who know where they stand do not drift with the emotional current of the group. They are not easily swayed by social pressure because their values are articulated internally. That doesn't make them rigid, but it does make them anchored. In uncertain situations, anchoring is invaluable. Groups seek it instinctively. This presence is not intimidating in a crude way. It doesn't dominate or diminish others. Instead, it creates a container in which others can function more effectively. Conversations become clearer. Decisions become more focused. Conflict, if it arises, is more likely to be addressed directly rather than avoided or escalated. The room shifts not because someone demands control, but because order has quietly entered the space. Such presence cannot be faked for long. It is not a technique that can be adopted without substance behind it. It is the residue of disciplined living, honest self-assessment, and responsibility carried consistently. Over time, these elements crystallize into a way of being that precedes speech. People feel it before they understand it, and they adjust themselves accordingly because stability has arrived. And stability always reorganizes chaos around it. Energy that refuses permission is not reckless defiance or blind rebellion. It is the consequence of an internal authority that has already been established. Most people operate by seeking approval before action. They look outward for signals that it is acceptable to move, speak, create, or lead. That habit keeps them psychologically dependent and chronically hesitant. When someone no longer requires that external validation, their energy changes in a way that is immediately perceptible. This refusal is not aggressive. It is quiet and unannounced. It shows up as initiative taken without asking, responsibility assumed without delegation, and truth spoken without rehearsal for applause. The individual is not trying to provoke. They are oriented toward necessity rather than permission. If something needs to be done, and they are capable of doing it, they act. That alone separates them from the majority, who wait for consensus or instruction, even when action is clearly required. This kind of energy is unsettling because it bypasses social negotiation. Many systems rely on unspoken agreements about who is allowed to act and when. These agreements are often less about competence and more about hierarchy, fear, or tradition. When someone steps outside that framework, without hostility or apology. It exposes the arbitrariness of those constraints. People sense that the rules they've been obeying may not be as binding as they believed. The foundation of this energy is responsibility. A person who refuses permission has already accepted the consequences of action. They are not insulated from failure, criticism, or conflict, but they are prepared to absorb those costs. That preparedness removes the need to ask. Permission seeking is often a strategy to offload responsibility. If approval is granted, blame can be shared. Refusal to seek permission means ownership is total. There is also a deep relationship between this energy and competence. Acting without permission is only sustainable when paired with skill and judgment. Otherwise, it degenerates into chaos. But when competence is present, action becomes self-justifying. Results speak. Over time, authority accrues naturally, not because it was requested, but because it proved necessary. People begin to defer not out of obligation, but because experience has shown that this person can be trusted to act effectively. Internally, this orientation requires clarity of values. Without that clarity, action becomes impulsive. But when values are articulated and hierarchized, decision-making accelerates. The individual does not need to consult external opinions constantly, because they have already determined what matters most. That internal compass replaces the need for permission and reduces hesitation. This energy also resists victimhood. Waiting for permission often disguises itself as powerlessness. It allows people to claim that inaction was imposed rather than chosen. Refusing permission removes that narrative. It forces confrontation with one's own agency. That confrontation can be uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. It restores a sense of authorship over one's life. In social contexts, this energy shifts dynamics quickly. People either rise to meet it or retreat. Those who are prepared recognize it as leadership. Those who are not may perceive it as a threat. But the reaction is secondary. What matters is that movement has occurred. Stagnation has been disrupted. Something has changed because someone decided that waiting was no longer acceptable. This refusal does not reject cooperation or dialogue. It simply rejects paralysis. It recognizes that progress is often made by individuals who move first and justify later, not through arrogance, but through commitment. When energy is aligned with responsibility, competence, and values, it no longer asks if it may proceed. It proceeds because it must, and the world reorganizes itself in response to that movement.